You're just 9 years old. It's evening in your quiet hillside village. The lanterns are lit. Your mother is boiling lentils. Your father is singing a hymn under his breath. And then, hooves. Loud. Fast. Too many. The men who arrive don't speak your language. They wear polished armor and carry scrolls. One of them points directly at you. Your name is read from the paper like an item on a market list. You try to run. But there is nowhere to run. By morning, you're shackled to 10 other boys, some younger than you. No one is crying anymore. Crying stopped hours ago. It stopped when the last boy who screamed was struck so hard he never stood up again. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what they'll do to you. But you already understand one thing. You'll never see your mother again. And the men who took you? They didn't come for war. They didn't come for gold. They came for bodies. And yours was just the right age. The celestial dynasty of Shan-Zhao was known for its unmatched elegance. Palaces that touched the clouds, scrolls of silk inked with divine law, and harmony that echoed from mountaintop temples to coastal markets. Poets praised it. Merchants feared it. Foreign emissaries bowed to it. From the outside, it was an empire of wisdom and balance. But behind the carved jade walls and ceremonial parades was something far older than governance, something darker than conquest. Beneath the polished order lay a truth carefully veiled by ritual and paper fans. This empire didn't just rule with armies or taxes. It ruled by ritualized possession of bodies, a tradition so sacred that to question it was blasphemy. Generations of noble-born children vanished behind silk curtains, given not to education nor to marriage, but to ancient laws of service that promised purity through pain. And those who resisted, their names were erased before their bones even cooled. This wasn't a hidden vice, nor the perversion of a single mad emperor. It was a system. Ancient, calculated, perfected. For over 400 years, the rite of sacred submission was encoded into dynastic law, a doctrine preserved not in whispers but in ledgers, temple decrees, and royal charters. Each offering was documented, categorized, and rotated through seasonal chambers based on age, beauty, and compliance. This wasn't about love, lust, or even reproduction. It was about obedience. About breaking a soul so thoroughly that it no longer remembered freedom. Officials called it flowering. Priests called it divine absorption. But within the palace walls, everyone knew what it meant. The child would not return the same. The empire trained scribes to observe reactions, how long the trembling lasted, whether the crying continued into morning. Those who failed to please were sent for ritual correction, a process so severe that few returned. And those who did, smiled too quickly. The dynasty didn't simply consume its victims. It reordered them, reprogrammed them, until even the pain became sacred, until even silence became worship. And in this silence, an entire civilization pretended nothing was wrong, because the record said everything was in perfect harmony. It began with a celebration, the spring of selection. Villages along the southern provinces were summoned by decree. Every family with daughters between the ages of 8 and 14 was required to present them at the Red Pavilion. The chosen ones would bring honor. The rest would return in silence. It sounded like privilege, but for the girls, it was the beginning of erasure. They were stripped of family names, measured for symmetry, bathed in sandalwood, powdered in crushed pearl. Their voices were tested, not for singing but for softness. Any signs of rebellion, even clenched fists or darting eyes, were noted by the eunuchs who stood silently behind folding fans. Some girls disappeared before the final selection. It was said they were too impure to offer. No one ever saw them again. The chosen were paraded into the imperial garden at dusk. They were told to smile, told not to cry. Each one walked barefoot down a stone corridor into a screening chamber where 5 masked officials observed them from behind silk partitions. These men did not speak. They simply watched and judged. The highest-rated girls, the ones deemed most spiritually compatible, were taken to the Phoenix Chamber that same night. They would not sleep. They would not speak again for many days. No one ever explained what happened in the Phoenix Chamber. But those who entered emerged days later with fresh jade tags around their necks, marking them as opened. They no longer resisted instruction. They bowed too quickly, ate without chewing, stared without blinking. The empire called it transformation. The villagers called it ascension. But the girls who returned, if they returned at all, were never quite girls again. They walked differently. They flinched at gentle hands. They never asked for home. The empire didn't just take their bodies. It rewired their minds. After opening, the girls were transferred to the chamber of reflection, A silent hall lined with mirrored walls and ceiling murals depicting goddesses in eternal obedience. They were forbidden to speak their birth names. Forbidden to remember the faces of their mothers. Each day began with ritual kneeling and recitations. I am not mine. I belong to the breath of heaven. Any hesitation meant punishment, not with whips but with isolation. Hours. Days. In a black lacquered box barely large enough to sit upright. No light. No sound. Just the echo of their own breath. They were trained to smile without meaning it. To touch without feeling. They learned to ask for permission to sleep, to weep, to eat. They were given new names, often after flowers, but only those that bloomed briefly. Lotus. Plum. Chrysanthemum. A reminder that beauty was fleeting. That silence was survival. Some resisted, at first. They whispered to each other at night, humming lullabies their mothers used to sing. But one by one they stopped, either from fear or forgetfulness. The older girls, the ones who had survived 2 or 3 cycles, became enforcers. They taught the younger ones how to bow properly, how to swallow tears with tea. Not out of cruelty but out of mercy. Do it right, they'd whisper. They won't hurt you if you do it right. The empire called this training a form of divine refinement, a necessary passage into higher femininity. But the truth was simpler. They weren't raising concubines or priestesses. They were engineering obedience. And the more a girl forgot, the more valuable she became. Until even her screams were practiced. Until even her silence was choreographed. Deep within the palace, past the ceremonial courts and perfumed chambers, lay a corridor few dared to mention, the corridor of dusk. At its end was a door with no handle, guarded by 2 eunuchs who never spoke and never blinked. Behind it was the veiled garden, a place not listed in any royal map or temple scroll. This was where the whispered rites were performed, a secret tradition reserved only for those marked with a red lotus at birth. These children weren't chosen. They were bred. Born from concubines who conceived during eclipse nights, they were said to carry divine darkness in their blood. From infancy they were raised in complete isolation. No sunlight, no outside voices, no mirrors. They were fed only by hand, touched only with gloves, and never allowed to hear their own names spoken aloud. When they turned 13, they were brought to the veiled garden, where the rite of binding took place. No one outside the imperial lineage was allowed to witness the ritual. But fragments remain, etched into cracked floor tiles, half erased from forbidden scrolls. It involved silence, blindfolds, and the mixing of blood with melted lacquer. The participant was not expected to survive the first rite. If they did, they would never walk among the public again. They were confined to inner sanctums, visited only by the emperor or his highest priests. These were not servants, not lovers. They were sacred vessels. Objects of power and suffering, whose agony was believed to nourish the empire's spiritual balance. To touch one without permission was death. To disobey one's role within the rite was worse. It meant vanishing not just from the palace, but from memory. Because some offerings weren't sacrificed. They were erased. The empire didn't need to hide what it was doing, because over time no one questioned it. The rituals became tradition. The offerings became ceremony. And the pain became policy. Entire provinces adapted their lives around the selection seasons. Midwives were bribed to falsify birth dates. Parents maimed their own daughters to make them ineligible, breaking fingers, burning faces with herbs, feeding them crushed bone to stunt their growth. It wasn't cruelty. It was protection. Priests rewrote doctrine to justify obedience. Scribes cleansed records of defectors. Historians were forbidden to mention the vanished. The imperial calendar marked not rains or harvests, but cycles of submission. Every 7th spring was the blooming, when the largest processions were held. By then no one needed threats. Families offered their children willingly not because they believed, but because resisting meant extinction. Rebellion didn't just fail, it vanished without echo. Temples burned. Entire bloodlines disappeared from archives. Even whispers could draw attention. And so, generations learned to forget. Mothers taught their daughters how to smile through inspections. Boys learned never to look too long at the palace gates. The trauma passed quietly, like breath held between prayers. The dynasty endured not just because of its armies or gold, but because it rewrote the very concept of duty. Pain became identity. Silence became legacy. And in the end, those who suffered most were the ones who remembered, because memory in an empire built on obedience was the most dangerous rebellion of all.